Hello and welcome to the return of History Stuff. After almost a year away, I have since moved house, so in place of the old background you've got this rather disturbing white wall to look at, as well as a hairy man in a gilet and a pair of glasses. So as you can see, no expense has been spared, because there's been no expense really. And to kick things off, the subject of this video is a very dynamic and interesting figure from the period we know as the Wars of the Roses, the civil wars in England in the mid to late 15th century. And this man's name was John de Vere. He was the 13th Earl of Oxford. He is also, not uncoincidentally, the star of a series of novellas I'm currently writing. I'll just do a very brief ad for these. The first one, called KINGBREAKER Part 1, Rebel and Traitor, is available on Amazon, on Kindle, hopefully soon in other formats. And I'll put a link in the description below if you fancy giving it a shot. KINGBREAKER is a pun on the Kingmaker, which was the nickname of Oxford's more famous comrade, sometime ally, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, Warwick the Kingmaker. So in this first video in a series on the life of John de Vere, I just wanted to explore his early years and general background and context. So he was born in 1444. He was the second son of the 12th Earl of Oxford, also named John. His eldest brother Aubrey should have inherited the earldom, but both Aubrey and his father got involved in this very unsuccessful conspiracy against the Yorkist king Edward IV in 1462. This is the early stages of the Wars of the Roses, in which Edward has only just defeated the Lancastrians and effectively deposed the Lancastrian king Henry VI. And he's still quite unsteady on his throne because he's won it in battle, really. There's all kinds of plots and conspiracies against him, and this is one of them, and it's a complete failure, really. It's very badly organised, and the 12th Earl and his son Aubrey and all of their followers were very quickly arrested, convicted, sentenced to death and executed on Tower Hill in February-March 1462. And according to some chronicles, Aubrey, John's eldest brother, was singled out for a particularly brutal execution. The others are merely beheaded, but Aubrey was supposedly hung up by his wrists and then disemboweled and allowed to bleed out until he died, which was an extremely harsh and quite unusual form of execution, and could be taken as symbolic. It would seem that Edward IV, the Yorkist king, blamed him mainly for this revolt and wished to inflict a particularly awful punishment on him for everyone to see in public on the scaffold at Tower Hill. But in the aftermath, Edward doesn't take any further action against the de Vere family, and he actually restores John, our John, to the earldom of Oxford. He allows him to inherit all of his father's lands and titles, which are all in the east of England, mainly the counties of Suffolk and Essex. This is the power base of the de Vere family. And John is allowed to have the title. He is now the 13th Earl of Oxford. He's about 18 years old at this point. And Edward may have calculated that he could turn John into a loyal supporter, make him a Yorkist, basically, because he's quite young, he's quite inexperienced, and Edward, although he's Edward IV, although he's very ruthless when he needs to be, and he doesn't brook any opposition, he's quite willing to execute people he regards as traitors. He doesn't want to just wade in blood and slaughter his aristocracy, because he needs these people. And to begin with, at least, he tries to bring John on the side and make him his friend. John is frequently summoned to court. He and Edward dine off the same plate, apparently, which is something Edward insists upon as a mark of royal trust and favour. And John is also allowed to strengthen his power base in the eastern part of England, in East Anglia. He's granted all sorts of titles and commissions. And he's doing well, really. He's riding high, and on the face of it, doesn't really have any sort of tangible reason to rebel against the king, except, of course, that the king has executed his father and elder brother, and this is something that John is not willing to forgive or forget. And while on the surface he's behaving like this sort of very loyal follower and courtier, underneath he's nursing this grudge, this burning resentment, and he's absolutely hell-bent on getting revenge on Edward and the entire House of York, and bringing the Yorkist power base crashing down, deposing Edward, killing him, and restoring the old king, Henry VI, who by this point is a prisoner in the Tower of London. And Edward eventually gets wind of this in about 1468, and he has John arrested and committed to the Tower. This all happens very suddenly. We're not sure of the precise charges against John, but it seems almost certain that he had been in treasonable contact with the Lancastrians in France, because the surviving Lancastrians had fled to France and joined a court in exile which had been set up by Margaret of Anjou. Margaret was Henry VI's wife. She was French, and she had been married to Henry decades previously in an effort to heal the war between England and France and bring an end to the so-called 100 Years' War. And she was determined to win back the throne for her husband. And so, with the support of her cousin, the King of France, King Louis, she had set up this court in exile in the city of Angers in the Loire Valley, where all of the surviving Lancastrians who wished to continue the fight against the Yorkists, they all went there to join her and plot a new invasion of England. And John had been in contact with them. Somebody had got wind of this and reported it to Edward, who had John arrested and interrogated at the Tower. And to save himself, John does a not very heroic thing, and he turns king's evidence, which means that he named other conspirators in exchange for saving his own life, saving his own skin, which isn't a very sort of noble or courageous thing to do. But on the other hand, it's a question of survival, because he had seen what had happened to his father and his brother, and he knew that Edward was perfectly willing to kill him if he thought it was necessary. So, to save himself, he throws all these other men under the bus. There's about 7 or 8 of them, and they're either imprisoned or executed. John, however, is released, which is a big mistake on Edward's part, because despite being let go, being released, John isn't willing to let go of his desire for revenge on Edward and the Yorkists, and he soon enters into a new conspiracy with the aforesaid Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and George, Duke of Clarence, who is Edward's brother. And the two don't get along at all, they're estranged. Both Warwick and Clarence team up. Warwick is a former friend of Edward's, but they've since fallen out. And they plan to destroy Edward and replace him with King Henry, which is exactly what Oxford wants to do. So the 3 of them team up and form this sort of triumvirate against King Edward. So we're heading into the 10-minute mark now, and ideally these videos should be kept relatively short. So I'll leave off there with England on the brink of yet another round of civil war. This is 1469 now. And in the next episode I'll go into the bloody events of 1469 and 1470, in which Oxford and his new friends Warwick and Clarence do everything in their power to defeat Edward. So that's coming up in part 2. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.